Good morning. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you today and missing what I'm sure will be a very stimulating collection of papers, actually of just the kind of interdisciplinary collection that we would hope to encourage here at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. The Oak Spring Garden Foundation is located in Northern Virginia, just west of Washington, D.C., in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I hope you'll keep an eye on us at osgf.org and the programs that we're beginning to develop. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this meeting, not only because the pineapple is fascinating in its own right, but because there's a clear connection between the Botanical Library collections at Oak Spring and Cambridge University. The Oak Spring estate is the former home of Paul and Bunny Mellon. Paul attended Clare College, receiving a BA in 1931, an experience that more than solidified his Anglophile predisposition. And there's a further connection. The pineapple has a curiously strong presence in Virginia, where, reflecting the trade links between the slave economies of the colonies and the Caribbean, it became a symbol of wealth and hospitality in colonial times. George Washington, as a young man, making his only trip outside of North America, recorded the culinary wonders of the island of Barbados. Among the fruits he enjoyed were China orange and avocado, as he called it. However, Washington admitted that while the pear was generally most admired, none pleases my taste as do the pine. Several Virginia plantations, such as the Shirley Plantation, established in 1613 on the James River southeast of Richmond with its pineapple finial, incorporate the pineapple motif into their mid-18th century colonial architecture. In colonial Williamsburg, the pineapple pops up everywhere, from the gift shop with its abundant pineapple-themed paraphernalia to the Pineapple Inn and Housing Centre that provides temporary housing for students and other guests. And in Charleston, South Carolina, another important colonial city in the southern US, the pineapple is similarly ubiquitous, including in the bronze and stone pineapple fountain in Waterfront Park. And finally, of course, there's the connection to John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, the last colonial governor of Virginia, who fled to New York in 1776 after the burning of Norfolk by the British during the Revolutionary War. On his Stirlingshire estate, Murray had one of the many late 18th century greenhouses in which pineapples were grown. And it was on his return from Virginia that he added the Palladian lower floor portico and the anasial flourish of the upper floor pavilion with its pineapple-shaped cupola. The Oak Spring Library contains no such flourishes, but standing isolated in abandoned horse pasture on the Oak Spring estate, it's perhaps no less incongruous. It was the creation of Rachel Lambert Bunny Mellon, who designed the rose garden at the White House for President Kennedy, collected books, manuscripts, and art related to plants, gardens, and landscapes for more than 8 decades. Among its several thousand works are many that illustrate the persistent fascination of people with pineapples, especially through the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, among the illustrations in the Oak Spring Library are the original 152 watercolours produced by Augusta Innes Withers and Charles M. Curtis for John Lindley's Pomological magazine. This hand-coloured engraving for Giorgio Bonelli, illustrating a pineapple from the Botanical Garden in Rome, and this unpublished mid-18th century body colour drawing by Franz Schiedel, and these still earlier engravings of pineapples growing in the London garden of James Sherard, Professor of Botany at Oxford, that were included by Johann Dillenius in his Horti Elthamenthis from 1732. There are also works on the cultivation of pineapples, such as this from 1767 by John Giles, gardener to Lady Boyd at Lewisham, Kent, and this treatise on the culture of the pineapple and the Management of the Hothouse from 1786 by William Speechley, which includes details of insect pests and this plan of an approved pine and grape stove. Pomona Britannica, a work published in 1812, tells us this most charming fruit, the very crown of our desserts, is now brought to the highest state of perfection. We now have many varieties, some of which may be considered as fancy pines, but it's generally considered that 7 or 8 combine most of the best. Brookshaw illustrates 8 varieties, 4 shown here. He also illustrates the jagged leaf black Antigua, which I illustrate to make a connection to the winter home that Paul and Bunny Mellon kept in Antigua, and in which there were 2 imposing mid-18th century trompe-l'oeil paintings by Edmé Jean-Baptiste Douay. One has a centerpiece of a tropical heliconia. In the other, it's the pineapple that takes pride of place. Several decades before Douay, Maria Sibylla Merian published her illustrations of the pineapple based on the observations that she had made during her time in Suriname. And this now famous illustration, perhaps one of the most famous and certainly one of the most viewed of all early illustrations of the pineapple, was featured on a set of US postage stamps issued in 1997 in collaboration with the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Merian, born in Frankfurt in 1647 and the daughter of the Swiss-born Basel engraver Matthias Merian, was trained in art by her stepfather, the engraver, printer and publisher Jacob Marel. She was interested in insects from an early age, raised silkworms as a young woman, and published her first book of natural history illustrations in 1675. In May 1665, Merian had married Johann Graf, and in 1668 and 1678 gave birth to her 2 daughters, Johanna Helena and Dorothea Maria. During this time, she'd been observing insects, had been giving daily drawing lessons to wealthy women, creating embroidery designs, and making copper engravings. She also began the publication of her first book of natural history illustrations in 1675, a series in 3 parts, which she completed in 1680. In 1679, Merian published the first volume of a 2-volume series documenting her careful observations on the metamorphosis of caterpillars. The second volume followed in 1683. Each volume contained 50 plates engraved and etched by Merian. Along with the illustrations, she described living insects, moths, butterflies, and their larvae that she had observed, and the plant hosts of 186 European species. This was groundbreaking work in ecology and in the early development of scientific entomology. Merian's marriage was an unhappy one, and in 1681 she moved to live with her mother and daughters, including in the Labadis colony in Friesland, where she stayed until moving to Amsterdam in 1691. Her husband divorced her in the following year. However, around the same time, her daughter Johanna married Jacob Herold, a successful merchant with interests in Suriname, and in 1699 she was granted permission to travel to Suriname with her younger daughter Dorothea Maria. So at the age of 52, she left Amsterdam on the 10th of July 1699 and arrived in Suriname in mid-September. She describes the background to this perilous expedition as follows. In Holland, I was astounded to see what lovely creatures were brought back from the East and West Indies, particularly when I had the honour of being able to see the precious collection of the most honourable Mr. Nicolaas Witsen, Burgomaster of the city of Amsterdam and administrator of the East India Company, as well as that of the Honourable Mr. Jonas Witsen, secretary of the same city. In these collections, I found these and countless other insects, but their origin and reproduction were lacking. That is, how they transform themselves from caterpillars into butterflies and so forth. This inspired me to undertake a long and costly journey and to sail to Suriname in America, a hot and wet country, from where the above gentleman received these insects in order to pursue my observations. After her return in 1705, she published her classic work Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium, in which Surinese caterpillars and worms, as she said, are described and depicted from life with all their transformations, each being placed on the plants, flowers and fruits on which they were found, in which also the reproduction of frogs, wonderful toads, lizards, snakes, spiders and ants are shown and described, everything painted and described in America from life and in life size. She completed 60 works on vellum, depicting 90 species of insects and 53 species of plants. There are 3 illustrations of pineapples, 2 at the beginning of the main text and another incorporated into the frontispiece. She opens her work with the pineapple, saying, "Since the ananas is the most important of all edible fruits, it is only right that it's also the first of this work and of my findings. It's shown in bloom on plate 1, just as a ripe one will be visible on the next." The Oak Spring Library contains the original 1705 edition and a beautifully coloured copy of the 1719 edition published after Merian's death by her daughters, which is seen here. She notes, "On the crown of the pineapple sits a small reddish worm, which is making a thin cocoon in which lies a small pupa. This is the worm that eats the cochineal." The names added below the Merian illustrations were provided by Caspar Commelin, nephew of the well-known botanist Jan Commelin, who was then in charge of the Horti Medici Botanicus in Amsterdam, who notes in the case of the pineapple, the particular names that were given to this plant by various authors are to be found with the others in my Flora Malabarica. Jan Commelin himself had illustrated the pineapple in his account of the plants growing in the Amsterdam medicinal garden that was published in 2 volumes between 1697 and 1701. Regarding the fruit, she states, "This is a ripe ananas. If one wishes to eat it, it is peeled. The peel is as thick as a thumb. If it's peeled too thinly, sharp little hairs remain sticking to it, which penetrate the tongue while eating and cause quite some pain. This fruit tastes as though grapes, apricots, red currants, apples and pears had been mixed together, which one could perceive all at once in it. Its scent is lovely and strong. When they are cut open, the whole room smells of it. The crown and the shoots, which sprout from the sides, are planted in the earth. They become new plants again. They grow easily as weeds. The young shoots need 6 months to reach maturity. They are eaten both raw and cooked. One can also press them and distill them to make wine and brandy, which both have a delicious taste and surpass all others. Merian's representations of the pineapple are among the most iconic and recognizable of all the representations of the king of fruits. They're also relatively early compared to the flood of illustrations of this distinctive plant that follow through the 18th and 19th centuries. But in a sense, they were a byproduct of her primary interest in insects. Under difficult tropical conditions, faced with unfamiliar plants and animals, and in a relatively short time, she found it hard to replicate the kind of careful observations that she'd been able to carry out in Europe. In the pineapple illustration to the left, the insects she features include 2 kinds of ubiquitous cockroach that have no specific relation to the pineapple, while in the illustration to the right, she includes a caterpillar and the cochineal scale insects on which it feeds. Merian remained in Suriname for only 2 years before being forced by malaria to return to Amsterdam in June 1701. But Merian makes it very clear that observational accuracy was not her only concern. She says, "In making this work, I have not been profit-seeking and would be content if I just recover the expenses I have made. I have spared no expense in the production of this work, but have had the plates cut by the most famous masters and used the best paper for that purpose, so that it would give pleasure and satisfaction to the art connoisseurs as well as to the amateurs of insects and plants, just as I will be pleased when I hear that I have reached my objective and at the same time will have provided pleasure." As noted in the English translation of her work, Merian was dedicated to beauty. The word beautiful occurs 19 times in the translation, and the word lovely no fewer than 39 times. Merian's superb illustration from 1705 was reproduced within a decade by her correspondent Volkamer in his Nürnbergische Hesperides, published from 1708 to 1714, in which he also copied the illustration by Commelin. At the same time, Volkamer added notes on how to grow the pineapple, some of his new illustrations, and a cross-section of the fruiting inflorescence. A longitudinal section of the pineapple is also included in the illustration by the Jesuit priest Michael Boehm, who journeyed to China in the middle of the 17th century. Boehm's Flora Sinensis, published in 1656, is interesting for the early documentation of the pineapple and 4 other useful plants from the New World, cashew, papaya, guava, and sugar apple, in China, or at least in adjacent Eastern or Southeastern Asia at a relatively early date, testifying to the speed at which useful plants were moved from one continent to another. Already by the 17th century, such intercontinental plant exchanges had been underway for a century and a half. Pineapples in southern China may have travelled there not only with the Portuguese from Brazil to Mozambique to India, but also across the Pacific with the Spanish from Mexico to the Philippines. That the pineapple, Ananas commosus, is a New World plant is not in doubt. It's a member of the family Bromeliaceae, a family of nearly 3,500 species, all but one of which are restricted to the Americas, with most in tropical South America, and only a single species native to the Old World, with a very restricted distribution in West Africa. Merian's unrivaled early depiction of the pineapple predates the work of Linnaeus, who first came across the pineapple in the garden of the Anglo-Dutch merchant George Clifford in the 1730s, and he included it in his Hortus Cliffortianus in 1737. With regard to earlier Western encounters with the pineapple, in the excellent analysis by Berthoud Laufer, he notes, "The documents at our disposal warrant the conclusion that at the time of the conquest, the pineapple was a thoroughly cultivated plant and occupied the area of Brazil, Guyana, Colombia, part of Central America, and the West Indies. Although not mentioned by Columbus himself, the pineapple is placed on record by his contemporaries and Epigenes, who made use of his and his companions' diaries and letters." Regarding the arrival of living pineapples in Britain, Laufer follows John Wright, who notes that John Evelyn, in his diary of 1661, says, "I first saw the famous queen pine brought from Barbados and presented to His Majesty, that is Charles II, but the first that was ever seen in England were those sent to Cromwell 4 years earlier." By the zenith of Britain's colonial powers, the pineapple was cultivated widely, as reflected in these illustrations by unknown Chinese and Indian artists represented in the Oak Spring collections. Also at Oak Spring is this striking image from an unpublished work, The Fruits of the Lima Market, by Dorothea Eliza Smith, a gifted amateur artist who journeyed with her husband to Peru in the mid-19th century. It's interesting that Laufer argues that the pineapple was not grown in Peru until after European contact, and that Barbara Pickersgill, also an expert in the early domestication of the pineapple, feels similarly. Laufer is also not fully convinced of the antiquity of the fruit in Mexico. Evidently, there's still much to learn about the pre-Columbian history that created and dispersed the remarkable king of fruits through East and South America and into the Caribbean.